آج ہمارا ٹاپک آسٹنز تھیوری آف سوورینٹی یعنی آسٹن کا نظریہ اقتدار اعلیٰ ہے، اور اس نظریے کے اوپر تکثیر پسندوں کی تنقید۔ جن بوڈن اور تھامس ہابس اور بینتھم سبھی نے اقتدار اعلیٰ پر اپنے اپنے نظریات پیش کیے، لیکن جان آسٹن نے جو نظریہ پیش کیا اس نے پورے یورپ میں شہرت حاصل کی۔ اس کے باوجود کہ اس نظریے پر تنقید بہت ہی زیادہ ہوئی، لیکن آسٹن نے جو نظریہ اقتدار اعلیٰ پیش کیا اس نے بادشاہ کی ذات کو بہت زیادہ امپاور کیا۔ If a determined human superior, not in the habit of obedience to a like superior, receives habitual obedience from a given society, bulk of that determinate superior is sovereign in that society. اردو میں اس کا میننگ یہ ہے کہ ایک منفرد اور اعلیٰ و برتر شخص جو کسی اپنے جیسے اعلیٰ و برتر کا مطیع نہ ہو اور معاشرے کا ایک بڑا حصہ اس کی اطاعت کا عادی ہو، تو وہ عظیم اور اعلیٰ شخص اس معاشرے کا مقتدر اعلیٰ ہے۔ اقتدار اعلیٰ کے متعلق آسٹن کی یہ تعریف بڑی جامع اور بڑی واضح ہے، اور اس میں جو خصوصیات بیان کی گئی ہیں وہ کچھ اس طرح سے ہیں۔ ساورن کو اسپیسیفک کیا گیا ہے، کیونکہ آسٹن کے مطابق مقتدر اعلیٰ عوام سے بالاتر اور برتر ہوتا ہے۔ اس کا مطلب یہ ہے کہ اقتدار اعلیٰ کے لیے مقتدر اعلیٰ کی تلاش آسان ہے، کیونکہ وہ ایک مخصوص حیثیت کا حامل شخص ہے۔ اور دوسری جو امپورٹنٹ اقتدار اعلیٰ کے پاس طاقت ہے وہ ہے لا میکنگ کی، کیونکہ اقتدار اعلیٰ جو ہے وہ قانون ساز ہوتا ہے۔ آسٹن کے مطابق مقتدر اعلیٰ ریاست کے قوانین کو تشکیل دیتا ہے، وہ سب سے زیادہ بااختیار ہے، نہ کوئی اس کے برابر ہے اور نہ ہی اس سے کوئی بالاتر۔ آسٹن کے نزدیک قانون مقتدر اعلیٰ کا حکم ہے، اور ریاست کے افراد اور ادارے اس کے احکامات کی پابندی کرنے کے پابند ہیں۔ سب سے بااختیار جسے ہم کہہ سکتے ہیں سپریم پولیٹیکل پاور جو ہے وہ جس فرد واحد کے پاس ہے وہی مقتدر اعلیٰ ہے، اور وہ جو کہتا ہے اور وہ جو حکم دیتا ہے سارے ادارے اور سارے افراد ریاست کے اس کے احکامات کے پابند ہیں۔ تیسری جو بات اس اقتدار اعلیٰ کے اندر ہے کہ جان آسٹن کا یہ اقتدار اعلیٰ جو ہے انریسٹرینڈ بائی لا ہے، یعنی پابندیوں سے بالکل آزاد ہے۔ مقتدر اعلیٰ کے حکم کو قانون کا درجہ حاصل ہے، اور وہ لامحدود، مطلق العنان اور منفرد ہوتا ہے۔ کوئی بین الاقوامی قانون اس کو اخذ نہیں کر سکتا۔ اقتدار اعلیٰ کو تسلیم کرنا جو ہے وہ ایک فطری اطاعت کی بات ہو رہی ہے اس اقتدار اعلیٰ کے اندر جو جان آسٹن کا ہے، اور اس میں بنائے ہوئے قوانین کی پابندی کرنے ریاست میں موجود تمام افراد اور اداروں کا فرض ہو، اور فرض ہر کسی کو اپنی عادت بنا کر پورا کرنا چاہیے، کیونکہ جان آسٹن کے نظریہ اقتدار اعلیٰ کے مطابق اس اقتدار اعلیٰ کے احکامات کی تابعداری تمام افراد اور اداروں پر فرض ہے، اور سب لوگ اقتدار اعلیٰ کی عادتاً اطاعت کریں۔ جان آسٹن کا نظریہ اس بات کا غماس ہے کہ عادتاً اطاعت جو ہے وہ بہت ضروری ہے۔ اس کے علاوہ اگر ہم اسلامک سورنٹی کے حوالے سے تھوڑا سا دیکھتے ہیں تو اس میں انگلش جو لیجسلیٹر ہے जॉन ऑस्टिन, या जो एक पॉलिटिशियन था या लेजिस्लेटिव बॉडी का एक रुकन था, उसने इस बात की नफी की है जो कि सॉवरेंटी जो है, यूनिवर्सल सॉवरेंटी जो डिवाइन अलमाइटी के पास है, और चूंकि रियासत इंसान से वजूद में आती है, इसलिए इसमें इक़्तिदार आला का मालिक भी कोई और नहीं बल्कि इंसान ही है। और सिर्फ अकेला इंसान ही नहीं, अगर कोई पॉलिटिकल पार्टी यानी कोई इंसानी जमात और कोई और चीज़ जो कि कोई माफौकुल फितरत जो है, वो इक़्तिदार आला की मालिक नहीं हो सकती। जॉन ऑस्टिन के नज़दीक कोई भी पॉलिटिकल पार्टी जो इक़्तिदार में है और जो भी कोई शख्स फ़र्द वाहिद इक़्तिदार में है, वही इक़्तिदार आला का मालिक है। लेकिन तकसीर पसंदों की ऑस्टिन के नज़रिए के ऊपर तनकीद का एक अपना जो है पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू है, और चूंकि तकसीर पसंद को हम प्लूरलिस्टिस्ट कहते हैं, उन्होंने क्रिटिसिज्म किया है ऑस्टिन की थ्योरी के ऊपर, और यूरोप में इसको बहुत ज़्यादा पजीराई मिली है। और कोई भी फिलोसफर जो है उसके नज़रिए से मुतासर हुए बगैर नहीं रह सका। लेकिन गॉर्नर और मैकाइवर ने इसके नज़रिए को बहुत ज़्यादा सख्त करार दिया है। लिंडसे और देवगी और लास्की ने ऑस्टिन के नज़रिए को शदीद तनकीद का निशाना बनाया है, और उसमें डिमेरिट्स और डिफेक्ट्स तलाश किए हैं। सबसे इम्पोर्टेंट चीज़ तो स्पेसिफिक सॉवरेनिटी है, जिसके ऊपर उन्होंने तनकीद की है। इक़्तिदार आला का तयन करना नामुमकिन है, क्योंकि मौजूदा दौर में किसी सूरत भी एक शख्स या जमात को इक़्तिदार आला सौंपा जाना मुमकिन नहीं है, क्योंकि उस वक्त पूरी दुनिया में हर रियासत अपने सियासी, माशरती, मुआशी और सकाफती इदारों की तरक्की और तरवीज के लिए इनको आज़ादाना तरीक़ों से काम करने दे रही है। वैसे भी आजकल दुनिया में जमहूरियत का प्रचार किया जाता है, और डेमोक्रेसी के अंदर मौजूद मेजॉरिटी की गवर्नमेंट होती है, जिसमें अवाम की ख्वाहिशात और जज्बात का बहुत ज़्यादा ख्याल रखा जाता है। अमेरिका को जहां हम देखते हैं कि प्रेसिडेंट जो है उसके पास एग्जीक्यूटिव पावर्स हैं, लेकिन उसके पास अनलिमिटेड पावर्स हैं, और वो रायामा जो है उससे बहुत ज़्यादा ख़ुद को बाखबर रखता है। पब्लिक ओपिनियन जो है उसने उसको जनरेट किया है, और किसी सूरत भी रायामा को नज़रअंदाज नहीं किया जा सकता। बरतानिया में भी पार्लियामेंट अपने अवाम के रस्म व रवाज का और अपने अवाम के दीगर मामलात का बहुत ख्याल रखती है, और ऐसे कवानीन हरगिज़ नहीं बनाती जो कि अवाम की मर्जी व मंशा के ख़िलाफ़ हों। इससे ये साबित होता है कि इक़्तिदार आला का तयन मखसूस शख्स के हवाले से जदीद दौर में नामुमकिन है। जहाँ तक कानून की हैसियत का ताल्लुक है, अगर हम नेचर ऑफ लॉ को देखते हैं तो ऑस्टिन के मुताबिक कानून मुक़द्दर आला का हुक्म है, इसलिए मुक़द्दर आला तमाम क़वानीन से आज़ाद है, वो किसी का पाबंद नहीं, और कानून मुक़द्दर आला से कमतर है। ये नज़रिया जो है खुश फहमी पर मबनी है, क्योंकि सुप्रीमेसी ऑफ लॉ जो है वो एक खसूसियत है आज के सिस्टम ऑफ गवर्नमेंट में, जिसमें मास्टर्स जो हैं वो ताकत का सा चश्मा है, और किसी सूरत में भी ये नामुमकिन है कि मास्टर्स को पाबंद किया सके फ़र्द वाहिद के अहकामात का। और जदीद दौर में दस्तूर का अक्सर हिस्सा रस्म रिवाज पर मबनी होता है। अगर ऑस्टिन के नज़रिए को मान लिया जाए तो माशरती और मजहबी इक़्तिदार का तस्वुर ख़त्म हो जाए। बकौल देवगी, रियासत कानून की पैदावार है, ना कि क़वानीन रियासत की। और जो तकसीर पसंदों की तनकीद है इस हवाले से बड़ी इम्पोर्टेंट है। ऑस्टिन इक़्तिदार आला को नाकाबिल तकसीम, नाकाबिल इंतकाल कहा है, क्योंकि वो कहता है कि ये इंडिविसिबल है, इनअलाइनेबल है, जबकि हैगल और रोसियो और अरिस्टो वगैरह के नज़दीक जदीद रियासत में इक़्तिदार आला को मुख्तलिफ मुआशरती अंजुमनों, इदारों के ज़रिए चलाना होता है, क्योंकि उनके ख्याल में कोई भी जमहूरी रियासत उस वक्त तक खुशहाल और तरक्की से बहरावर नहीं हो सकती जब तक वहाँ पर इज्तिमाई फलाह बहबूद और तरक्की का एहतमाम न किया जाए। और ये बात इस वक्त तक मुमकिन नहीं जब तक मकामी इदारों और अंजुमनों को आज़ादाना तरीके से काम करने की इजाज़त न हो। जहां तक सियासी दायरा की नफी की बात है, जिसे हम निगेशन ऑफ पॉलिटिकल सॉवरेनिटी कहते हैं, ऑस्टिन सिर्फ और सिर्फ कानूनी दायरा का कायल है और सियासी दायरा की नफी करता है। उसके बकौल सिर्फ पार्लियामेंट्री कानून साजी की मजाज है या फिर एक मखसूस फर्द जो कि मुख्तराला है, वो जमहूरियत के दबाव का जिक्र नहीं करता। हालांकि पार्लियामेंट का इंतखाब तो अवाम ही करते हैं। ये कैसे मुमकिन है कि उनके मुंतखब करदा अफराद अवाम की राय के खिलाफ कानून साजी करें? और फिर अगर वो ये कहता है कि आदतन इताअत जो है ये बड़ा इम्पोर्टेंट बात है, कैसे लोग जो हैं किसी की आदतन इताअत कर सकते हैं? इसके ऊपर जो क्रिटिसिज्म है वो अपनी मिसाल आप है। ऑस्टिन कहता है कि अफराद मुक़द्दर आला के अहकामात की पैरवी आदतन करते हैं। ऐसा हमेशा नहीं हो सकता, क्योंकि कोई भी मुक़द्दर आला एक लंबे अरसे तक बरसदार नहीं रह सकता। वैसे भी अगर मुक़द्दर आला के अहकामात अफराद के मुआशरती, मुआशी और सियासी इक़दार के मुताबिक होंगे तो वो इसकी पैरवी करेंगे, वरना वो इसे रद्द कर देंगे। और जहाँ तक हम बात करते हैं थोड़ा सा मुख्तसर पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू, जो कि हम इस सूरत में ले सकते हैं कि इसके एनालिसिस में ये क्या सिचुएशन है, कि सियासी मुफक्किरीन का भी ये ख्याल है कि ऑस्टिन का नज़रिया वैसे तो बहुत जामे है और बड़ा वाज़ेह है, लेकिन और उसकी अहमियत से कभी इनकार नहीं किया जा सकता, क्योंकि इसको पढ़े बगैर हम रियल सॉवरेन को पढ़ नहीं सकते, ना उसको अंडरस्टैंड कर सकते हैं। John Davey, one political scientist or author, has analyzed Austin's theory of sovereignty. He says, a careful study of Austin's jurisprudence has convinced me that the theory which is ordinarily put forward under his name is not his at all. If it belongs to anyone, Hobbes and Cornwell Lewis deserve that we accredit it to them. So far as I can trace the origin of the statement which is usually put forward as Austin's, it came from Sir Henry Mine. From his early history of institutions, I take the following, which will serve as a sufficient statement of the ordinary misconception, whether originating with mine or not. So there is in every independent political community some single person or combination of persons which has the power of compelling the other members of the community to do exactly as it pleases. This sovereign has in all such communities one characteristic common to all the shape sovereignty may take, the possession of irresistible force, that which all the forms of sovereignty have in common is the power but not necessarily the will, to put compulsion without limit on subjects or fellow subjects. The phrases which I have italicized give the gist of the misconception. So the phrase which he has italicized, that is the put compulsion without limit on subjects or fellow subjects, and the irresistible force. There are many such vocabulary words which has been merged as italicized in the article of Mr. John Davey. So the phrases which are now shown in such situation give the gist of the misconception and the perversion, it may be called, of Austin's theory. The work of misstatement which mine commenced on the historical side, T.H. Green completed on the philosophical side. According to him, Austin's doctrine considers the essence of sovereignty to lie in the power to put compulsion without limit on subjects, to make them do exactly as it pleases. These statements give what I may without disrespect call the Austinian myth, as it has gradually developed. The Austinian myth that has been developed now, these statements, what Mr. Davy has given here, those are a disrespect. Cornwell Lewis regarded himself as a disciple of Austin and undoubtedly thought he was representing his master's doctrine correctly when he said, "As long as a government exists, the power of the person or persons in whom the sovereignty resides over the whole community is absolute and unlimited." But as a matter of fact, no such conception of sovereignty as consisting in absolute force is to be found anywhere in Austin. Before coming to a positive discussion of Austin's doctrine, it therefore seems necessary to get the false conception of his theory out of the way. The statement Austin has given that is typical. If perfect or complete independence be of the essence of sovereign power, there is not, in fact, the human power to which it will apply. Every government, let it be ever so powerful, renders occasional obedience to the commands of other governments, and every government defers habitually to the opinions and sentiment of its own subjects. To an indefinite though limited extent, the monarch is superior to the governed, his power being commonly sufficient to secure compliance with his will. But the governed collectively or in mass are also the superior of the monarch, who is checked in the abuse of his might by fear of exciting their anger and of arousing to active resistance the might which slumbers in the multitude. If it be said that Lewis too recognizes a distinction between legal and moral force and speaks of a use of the term sovereignty to signify the moral influence of a whole or a part of the community upon the facts and acts of the sovereign, the reply is that Lewis has absolutely no criterion by which to distinguish between moral and legal, while the characteristic thing in Austin is, as we shall see presently, the careful way in which he endeavors to fix a basis for such a distinction. So far as Lewis' theory is concerned, whatever actually exercises control must be sovereign. If the sovereign is influenced by the wishes of his subjects so as to defer habitually to them, they are really sovereign and he is the subject. And if a sovereign has not power to enforce his commands, he is not sovereign. Indeed, Lewis is essentially a legalist, Austin a moralist. Lewis is simply after a definition which will hold water legally. Austin, in spite of the legal force which his main work took, was like Bentham, preeminently interested in social reform and progress. Law, such as was to him a means to realize this reform. To be convinced of his, one has only to read his chapters on utility, introduced at the outset of his lectures. And these lectures, and note especially what he has to say upon the importance of diffusing correct ethical knowledge among the masses of the people. If Lewis thus completely inverts Austin's conception, it is perhaps not surprising to find that the necessity of basing force upon some common interests and purpose, which Green urges against Austin, is not only recognized, but stated by Austin at considerable length. He defines the proper end of a sovereign political government, the purpose or end for which it ought to exist, to be the greatest possible advancement of human happiness. He thus recognizes as distinctly as Green a moral and back of and controlling the political institution. Not only this, but he recognizes that the motive which induces men to obey government is, even under existing conditions, very largely an ethical one and not mere fear of force, while under proper conditions it would be completely ethical. Supposing, he says, that a given society were adequately instructed or enlightened, the habitual obedience to its government, which was rendered by the bulk of the community, would exclusively arise from reasons bottomed in the principle of utility. And even as things are now, the recognition of the utility of government is the only cause of the habitual obedience in question, which is common to all societies, or nearly all societies. Utility being definitely Austin's moral standard. It would be worthwhile, I think, to reopen the question of Austin's theory of sovereignty, were it only for the purpose of bringing to light this current misapprehension. But that is not my main motive at present. Austin's real theory raises questions as important as does that of Lewis, which so far has done duty for Austin's questions, which are completely kept out of sight. However, in the ordinary way of stating it, it is these questions which I propose to raise in this article. I wish to point out that at the bottom Austin's conception and influence in much of the existing discussion, there is a confusion of sovereignty with the organs of its exercise, and that this confusion has, for its results, a radical error concerning the mode in which sovereignty is exercised. An error which, so far as acted upon, is likely to result in harm. I have already indicated that Austin has a specific criterion for distinguishing moral from legal order and influence. As it happens, the consideration of this criterion will also suffice to reveal Austin's theory of the residence of sovereignty, and thus to prepare the way for showing his confusion of sovereignty with an organ of its exercise. Austin begins by distinguishing between positive law and moral law, as he does not admit that anything but a command can properly be called a law. One differentia commonly employed for distinguishing between the two is not open to him. He referred to that which makes the moral law a law of the ought to be, while positive law is a law which actually obtains. Every law implies to Austin a person or persons who issues a command, the command being the signification of a wish, together with the power and purpose of inflicting an evil in case the wish is not complied with, being liable to evil from you in case he do not comply with the wish which you signify. He is bound or obliged by your command, and he lies under a duty to obey it. The positive law equally over the moral sets of duty. The moral law equally over the positive implies an actual force and a sanction. Both involve actual authority, an actual lawgiver, and an actual law subject, and therefore on Austin's theory, an evil to which the latter is liable from the former in case of disobedience. The distinction between the legal and the moral accordingly cannot be the presence or absence of a personal authority, imposing the command and enforcing obedience through sanctions. It can only be in some trait or characteristic of the authority imposing the command. What is the defining peculiarity of this authority? Positive law, according to Austin, is that set by a political superior to an inferior. Moral law must be distinguished into two classes. Moral law, properly so called, is a command proceeding from a determinate source and having a sanction and an obligation, yet not positive law, because not proceeding from a sovereign. Moral law, improperly so called, is that set by the opinions and sentiments of an indeterminate public. The difference between positive law and moral law, properly so called, depends then simply upon whether or not the rules are set by a sovereign. But how is this to be ascertained? A sovereign is a power, not in the habit of obedience to a determinate superior. The commands of such a power are positive law, while the commands of a power which is in the habit of obedience to a determinate superior are moral law. That is, the commands which a master issues to a slave or a parent to his child are truly laws, yet they are moral, not positive, because the superior power is, in turn, in the habit of obeying a power still above him. The distinction between moral law, improperly so-called, and positive law is not so clear on the surface. We have to remember that Austin admits that in one sense the opinions and sentiments of the mass are supreme in power. The sovereign habitually refers to them. From this point of view, then, moral law, improperly so-called, is above positive law. It controls in ultimate analysis the latter. Why not say that it, the general or controlling opinion, is sovereign? Here we finally come upon the distinguishing factor, disregard of which leads Lewis, Mayan, Green all astray. Laws proper must proceed from a determinate source, and the public at large is indeterminate. Sovereignty is defined by the following traits. The bulk of the given society are in the habit of obedience to a determinate and common superior. Number 2, the superior is not in the habit of obedience to a determinate common superior. This was written in volume 1 on page 226, 226. It is the determinateness of the authority which issues the commands, then, which is the sole essential differentia of sovereignty from the force exerted by public opinion. Austin admits as definitely as Mayan that obedience is rendered to other authorities than the sovereign. He admits as definitely as Green that a moral reason, a reason based on social welfare, underlies the bare fact of obedience to the government, and that society whose welfare is in question is always, as matter of fact, in possession of the supreme or controlling power, but it is not sovereign, because it is an indeterminate or vague body, while law proper can proceed only from a numerically determinate body. So far does Austin go in this direction that he holds that the whole political community is only figuratively called sovereign. The party truly independent is not the society, but the sovereign portion of the society. The following will sum up that part of Austin's definition of sovereignty, which alone is of further interest to us. An independent political society is divisible into two portions, namely the portion of its members, which is sovereign or supreme, and the portion of its members, which is merely subject. In most actual societies, the sovereign powers are engrossed by a single member of the whole, or are shared exclusively by a very few of its members. And even the actual societies whose governments are esteemed popular, the sovereign number is a slender portion of the entire political community. The question raised then by Austin's conception of sovereignty is precisely whether it resides in a specific numerical portion of the body politic. The question is of special interest in this country, for if Austin's theory is correct, the theory of popular sovereignty is obviously wrong, not only in the crude form in which it is ordinarily stated, but in any possible development of it. The first thing that strikes one is the slenderness of the reason given by Austin for limiting sovereignty to a part. Substantially, his argument is that every law must be a command, and that a command in the proper sense can proceed only from a person or persons capable of specific enumeration. Hence the rules set by public opinion are not truly laws, and hence the body holding the opinion cannot be said to be sovereign. For since it is not a body precisely determined or certain, it cannot, as a body, express or intimate a wish. As a body, it cannot signify a wish by oral or written words, or by positive or negative deportment. The so-called law or rule, which its opinion is said to impose, is merely the sentiment which it feels, or is merely the opinion which it holds in regard to a kind of conduct. To Austin, the statement that a body uncertain as to number cannot act as a body, and cannot therefore issue commands. Austin's theory is thus the complete antithesis of Rousseau's. According to Rousseau, it is of the essence of sovereignty to belong to the whole as a whole. For example, to the general will. According to Austin, it is of its essence to be partial. Green, in the criticism already referred to, opposes Austin and Rousseau as types of the theories which make sovereignty consist in force and will, respectively. I hope it is now obvious that both find it equally in will, but that one conceives of this will as necessarily inhering in a part, the other as inhering in the whole of the society. So, the issue commands seems so self-evident as to need no further argument. To one surrounded with institutions of a popular character and accustomed almost every day to see government affected and controlled by various agencies of clamor, mass meeting, petition, and newspaper writing, this inability of a body numerically uncertain to express itself as a body in ways having the force of command will, I think, seem less axiomatic. Austin himself admits that it is not the style in which the desire is signified that makes it a command. Willingness to inflict harm in case of disobedience is the essence of the command. Presses errant, sed quibus, contradici, non posset. These were commands, though taking the form of a humble request. He distinctly states that one who does not comply with the wishes of the indeterminate body, which sets the rule of public opinion, will probably suffer by reason of not complying some inconvenience or evil from some party or other, and that by this prospect of evil the acts of the persons obnoxious to it are influenced to take a specified form, and from this fact exhibit a steadiness and uniformity which they would otherwise probably lack. Against all this likeliness to true laws and to real sovereignty, the only point of distinction which marks off what Austin calls moral law, improperly so-called, is that the person who will enforce the so-called law against any future offender is never determinate and assignable. A somewhat slight sport, I submit, upon which to base the bold difference between law and moral sentiment, between real sovereignty and mere opinion. Indeed, it seems as if Austin were here reasoning simply in a circle. First, the law is defined as a command set by the sovereign, then having the benefit of the idea of sovereignty to help differentiate political from moral law. The sovereign is defined as the power which sets law, the idea of determinateness being slipped in so incidentally as almost to conceal its fundamental importance. Let us, however, grant Austin's assumption and see how stands the test of facts. Austin's idea of the residence of sovereignty in the United States is familiar to the students of constitutional law. His theory is that neither the federal government as such, nor the separate state governments as such, nor yet a combination of the two is sovereign. Going back to the clause of the Constitution, which indicates how amendments are to be made, he finds there the key to the problem. The sovereign is the electorate appointing the legislatures of the respective states, the electorate being taken as an aggregate body. What is this electorate? Either as a class or as to the particular members with composite who compose this. Suppose a generation has passed away since any amendment has been passed, or since any legislature has acted upon any amendment proposed by Congress. Where is the portion or class constituting the sovereign to be found? Those who actually determine the Constitution may no longer be living. If it be said that those who would vote in case a new question were submitted or the class sought for. This would base sovereignty not on the actual expression of wishes and the observance of these wishes by others under sanctions, but on a mere capacity and potentiality. Admit, however, that sovereignty can be thus latent. Then is the every individual who composes this possible electorate a sharer in sovereignty. He must be, if the clause is to be terminate, capable of having its constituents specified, yet per contra, it is evident that prior to any given vote, there is no way of telling in respect to any given individual whether he will be in the majority or in the minority. If it turns that he is one of the defeated party, we are in a hopeless dilemma. Our dilemma, if we say he did share in sovereignty because he had a right to vote, we say sovereignty may be exercised apart from the utterance of commands. Indeed, even in opposing the fundamental command, but we say that since not participating in the expression of the supreme command, he is not sovereign. The question arises by what right he voted at all. Why is he not disfranchised from this time on? Take again the citizens of a state which is one of the number constituting less than 1/4 of the whole. Suppose this state votes against any amendment which is adopted. Are the citizens in this state participants in sovereignty or not? We come here as before to an insoluble contradiction. Sovereignty is not determinate until after it has been exercised, until the vote has been taken. I fail to see how any definition whatever of sovereignty in the United States could be given which would not make it indeterminate in the sense in which Austin uses that word. Judge Jameson, in an article upon national sovereignty, wrote and has criticized the correctness of this definition as an account of the actual facts, and has also brought out the important fact that the electorate, always of a course a mere majority, not a whole, makes its decisions not as a separate whole, but within the processes of the nation itself, and controlled in a multitude of ways by this larger whole, of which it is in reality simply an organ. But I wish here to admit Austin's own definition and show that by his own definition, this sovereign is not determinate. If Austin were correct in supposing a numerically definite body essential to sovereignty, such uncertainty as this would mean that Great Britain is in a state of anarchy, having no such determinate body capable of detection even by a body of experts. Where Austin cracked, Great Britain would long ago have been engaged in a practical struggle to decide the uncertainty as to the possessors of sovereignty, since the anarchy could be settled only by having it clear that just this set of persons and no other were those from whom all laws proceed. The ultimate weakness of Austin's theory is that in identifying sovereignty with a part only of the body politic, he gives and allows no reason why this limited body of persons have the authority which they possess.